Well, I was trained at University of Chicago, and the professors there believed very strongly in the power of good ideas. I've always believed in that.
Just because an idea is thought good by some, it doesn't mean it'll be easy to convince others, even if it can help save the planet. Ideas like a carbon tax.
So I've always thought that we should always focus on what ideally countries should be doing and providing quantitative analysis to back that up. But at the same time, we have to think creatively about how can we improve the acceptability of the best policies. And also think creatively about, well, if we can't do the ideal policy for now, what are some next best alternatives that mimic some of the advantages of the ideal policy?
Ian Parry knows a good idea when he sees one and has championed carbon pricing to reduce global carbon emissions long before it was fashionable or even considered feasible by more than a handful of countries. Parry works in the Climate Policy Division of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department and has made it his mission to present, on behalf of the institution, the benefits of incorporating climate risks into the cost of doing business through a carbon tax, an idea that will be on the agenda at the upcoming COP28 meeting in Dubai later this month. Why do you think carbon pricing is such a good idea?
Well, I think there are three advantages of carbon pricing. First of all, it's effective at cutting emissions, as carbon prices are reflected in higher prices for fossil fuels, electricity, energy-intensive goods. That promotes across-the-board incentives to reduce energy use and shift towards cleaner fuels. Secondly, it can provide a strong fiscal benefit, easily more than offset any extra fiscal costs from having to compensate low-income households or the government investing in clean technology infrastructure. So you can raise extra revenues, improve the fiscal balances, and use that revenue for lowering taxes on workers and firms or funding investments for sustainable development goals. And then thirdly, carbon pricing can be straightforward to administer if it takes the form of a carbon tax, charge on the carbon content of fossil fuels that can just build off existing capacity for collecting excises on fuels.
So we talked about this back in 2019, and at that point, I guess it was the run-up to COP25 in Spain, I guess it was. But carbon pricing at that time was a concept that had started to gain some momentum, but it was a very hard sell for, I guess, a bunch of different reasons. Where do we stand today in terms of convincing 193 member countries that carbon pricing is, in fact, a good idea?
Well, you're right that there is momentum for carbon pricing. It's now operating in nearly 50 countries, whereas 20 years ago, carbon pricing didn't exist apart from in some Scandinavian countries. So there is momentum, and we've seen prices in the EU trading system rise to 90 euros per tonne. Canada's phasing in a carbon price of 170 Canadian dollars per tonne. China's introduced a variant of emissions trading. There are a lot of other countries considering carbon pricing, particularly in Asia. But there's a long way to go, both in terms of broadening the coverage of pricing schemes and raising the prices. So at the moment, only a quarter of global greenhouse gases are subject to prices. And then if we average across emissions which are priced and those which aren't priced, the global average price is only about $5 per tonne, whereas we need measures equivalent to a global carbon price upwards of $80 per tonne by 2030 to get on track with temperature goals. So why is this such a hard sell? I mean, it sounds so reasonable and it sounds like a great solution, the way that you describe it. Why is it such a hard sell? Well, I think it's because carbon pricing has significant impacts on raising energy prices, which in turn imposes significant burdens on households and firms, particularly firms competing in international markets. So it's important to enhance the acceptability of pricing so that for households we can use a small portion of the revenues are needed from carbon pricing to compensate low-income households. But the bulk of the revenues can be recycled back to households, perhaps in income tax cuts, perhaps in funding more schools or infrastructure projects. So that helps build support for the program. And then for firms, maybe some of the revenues that we collect from carbon pricing of industrial firms, maybe we could recycle those revenues back to firms to help them mitigate competitiveness impacts, or maybe combine carbon pricing with a border carbon adjustment, or ideally coordinate over carbon pricing with your trading partners so we're all acting together. But there is a balance between carbon pricing and other instruments. Pricing will need to be reinforced by sectoral-based measures, which are less efficient than carbon pricing, but have greater acceptability because they avoid a significant increase in energy prices. So, for example, we recommend the use of fee-based schemes here. These provide a sliding scale of taxes on products, activities that have high emissions intensity, and a sliding scale of rebates for products or activities with low emissions intensity.
So essentially, the polluters are paying the price for polluting.
Yeah.
And, I suspect that there are certain countries, like I think the United States, that aspect is more difficult to sell, right, than in other countries.
Yes, it's been very difficult to make progress on carbon pricing in the United States. It's also very difficult to project when it might become viable. If there's a serious debate about reducing budget deficits down the road, there'll be debate about, well, we need to either cut spending. What are you going to do? Cut defence spending or Medicare or Social Security? Or which taxes are you going to raise? You're going to impose higher Social Security taxes, higher corporate? None of those is very palatable. But, a carbon tax is in the mix there as well. And that, besides raising revenue, it helps you make progress on your climate commitments.
So there is a pretty significant fiscal element to all this.
Yeah.
And the numbers are huge, whichever way you look at it. I mean, in terms of investment required to find some technological solutions to this problem, the International Energy Agency says somewhere around $4 trillion. How much of that investment do you think is going to have to come from private sector investment, and how keen is the private sector in jumping into the climate technology game?
Yeah, I mean, the huge bulk could be promoted in the private sector and should be, because the private sector is the most, with the right incentives, that they'll provide the cost-effective investments. So because it's mostly, households adopting heat pumps or electric vehicles, steel companies shifting towards electrified processes, power generators shifting towards renewables plants. So maybe 70-80% or more of the investment should be done through the private sector, ideally.
Wow.
And much of the investment will be a redirection away from investments that would have occurred in fossil-based technologies or products towards clean products. So if we have the right price signal there to level the gap between the costs of clean technologies and fossil technologies, then that should promote this shift in investment away from fossil technologies to clean technologies.
So in terms of trying to attract that private investment, when you look at the U.S., they passed, I guess it was earlier this year, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA as it's commonly called. Is this the kind of thing that countries should be doing? Or do you think, as a lot of people do, that this kind of thing is more of a risk to international trade in terms of protectionism?
Well, I think on net it's a plus. It's going to significantly reduce emissions, and it's going to make the United States help them make headway on their pledge to cut emissions 50% by 2025, I think. But it's an inefficient approach for various reasons. One is that it focuses on a much narrower range of behavioural responses or mitigation opportunities than carbon pricing. So, for example, in the transport sector, this approach of subsidising electric vehicles, it won't encourage people to shift from fuel-inefficient gasoline vehicles to fuel-efficient gasoline vehicles, and it won't encourage them to drive less. Secondly, it's fiscally costly, whereas carbon pricing would be raising revenues for the government and improving fiscal balances. And then thirdly, because of the local content requirements, it's creating a lot of trade tensions.
And so do you think that there's another similar, approach in Europe? Do you think that's a more effective way of getting there, or getting that private investment?
Yes, I think that would strongly recommend the approach in the EU, where they have a very robust price on carbon emissions for the power and industry sector. And then they're transitioning towards a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which will enable them to maintain a robust price on emissions. So that's really created powerful incentives for firms in those sectors to shift to clean technologies.
And you mentioned earlier a global carbon tax, or at least a global consensus on carbon pricing. How feasible do you think that is, given that the US and China, the two biggest carbon polluters, are so far apart on this?
That's true, but I think there's grounds for optimism as well. So what we've proposed is a price floor arrangement among the large emitters, with prices that are differentiated according to development level, so higher for advanced countries, and countries have the flexibility to use other instruments so long as they achieve equivalent emissions outcomes as meeting the price floor would. So it's a pragmatic approach with prices aligned to get global emissions where they need to be by 2030 for the temperature targets. But I do think there's grounds for cautious optimism. I mean, it's in the interests of these large emitters like China and India, both of whom are especially vulnerable to climate change. It's in their interests to see the world succeed and keep temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. So they have a strong incentive to try and galvanize global action. India, their main concern, quite rightly, is to get assistance for their clean energy transition so they can put on the table, well, we'll raise our coal tax to $25 per tonne by 2030 if in return we receive a transparent amount of funding each year, which they could negotiate over. But more generally, I mean, over 190 countries are moving ahead with decarbonisation strategies over the next few decades. So I think it's just inevitable that sooner or later some group of countries will start coordinating over mitigation policy, whether it's in Latin America or Asia. And once coordination starts happening at a regional level, you could envision it catalyzing action at the global level.
Mm-hmm. And how effective do you think that these COP meetings that happen every year, how effective is that in terms of trying to bring countries together and achieving the climate goals, reducing carbon?
Well, I mean, progress is made on different aspects of the climate problem at these COP meetings, but in terms of the essential element, which has to be a scaling up of global action, we think some other forum is needed. That is, ideally, the large emitters would get together in a side agreement and have a concrete plan for aligning their policies and emissions with global temperature goals. And so you'd have a much smaller group of countries representing the majority of global emissions, but you would have a much more focused negotiation among that smaller group.
Well, Ian Parry is the principal environmental fiscal policy expert here at the fund in the Fiscal Affairs Department. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Again, Ian Parry works in the Climate Policy Division of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. You can learn more about his work in climate mitigation policy at imf.org. And you'll find more IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on X, what used to be Twitter, at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.